بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum
Jazakallah khairan everyone for coming once again to Sheikh and Shai. Bismillah, mashallah, I see a lot of new faces. So I'd just like to quickly go over and reiterate kind of what the premise of Sheikh and Shai is, just so everyone knows. It's an informal conversation to have with the Sheikh. We have a set kashif today. And you guys can chime in whenever you want. If you have any questions, raise your hand. We'll pick on you. Sister side as well. I believe, inshallah, there should be cue cards on the sister side for those of you who don't want to raise your hand. You can just pass it to the said kashif. So yeah, I guess the first question is, as you always start, you tell us a bit about yourself, your journey, kind of struggles and successes you've had while having a non-Islamic career, balancing that non-Islamic career with pursuing Islamic education.
Okay, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. So I think maybe it's appropriate to start with how Islam kind of entered my family and set me on a certain path. And maybe before we get to that, from an education perspective, I'm an electrical engineer. I graduated in 2011 from the University of Waterloo. I was involved with the MSA, did lots of events like this, so familiar with the building. Although we didn't have a musalla like this. We were stuck in, I don't know if we were stuck, but we were in SLC. And we were in the third floor room. I don't know if you guys still have that. But the feds used to bother us for capacity issues every Friday. This looks a little bigger, and you have some nice carpets, alhamdulillah. And in terms of my profession, I practiced as an electrical engineering for a few years, and then I moved on into the world of product management. So I've been in that world for about 5 years. I'm director of product management at a local tech company. We build intelligent transportation infrastructure. So that's a bit about me in terms of the career side of things. Islamically, I don't have any particular certificates from an institute or from a school or mahad or anything like that. But I will tell you that my family was not a religious family. So my origin, my parents are from Pakistan. They came to Canada in the 1970s. And both of my parents came here when they were teenagers. So just barely at the edge. So my dad was 21, my mom was 19. And they just gotten married. And my aunt lived here. So the condition that my grandmother set for my mom was, you can come to Canada only because your sister is here. And you're going to stay with her and she's going to take care of you. So that gives you a little bit of perspective in the sense that a lot of my parents' worldview was shaped by being in the West, by being in Canada. And they brought whatever little they had from Pakistan. On my mom's side, her family actually is Ismaili, or Qadiani, or not Qadiani, Ismaili Agha Khani. Right? So if you're aware of that, it's a particular branch of the Shi'as that have a particular belief that the imamate of Imam Ali continues until today. Okay, so when my mom got married to my dad, she converted to Sunni Islam. And my dad's family was not super practicing, but they were the kind, they know about Jum'ah, they go for Jum'ah, they know about Eid, but that's really the extent of it, right? And I lived most of my life like that. I went to public school. I was born and raised here in town. I went to kindergarten, starting in a public school here. And it wasn't until third grade that I found out that I had an Islamic identity, beyond like what was culturally part of our household. And that happened, we went back to Pakistan, and my uncle asked me, I remember I was sitting in his office and there were a few other kids there, and he was a real estate agent. And he's like, Yar, kalima shahada pa. He asked me, say kalima shahada. He wanted to test me. Say the kalima. I didn't know what that was. I was in third grade. So he didn't leave the embarrassment there. He said, recite Surah Al-Ikhlas. He said, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, recite, finish it for me. I couldn't recite it. Never even heard the surah before. Or maybe I'd heard it, but I did not know it. When we came back, I told my parents, I want to learn Quran. That was a situation that I felt so embarrassed by, that I didn't know this thing that I felt was so important for me. And so I started learning Quran. And that led me down a path where I frequented the masjid more and more often. I got connected with brothers from MAC, Muslim Association of Canada. I don't know if any of you work with MAC, but MAC has like an Usra program. They have a regular halaqah program. It's more of an intimate halaqah. You get kind of invited to it. They have a bit of a curriculum. I started doing that for a while. Then I started memorizing Quran. And a particular teacher actually just came from Pakistan. He was the Imam's brother-in-law, Mulana Ayub. So I memorized about 10 ajza with him, and I started my tahfidh journey with him. And that took me up into high school. And in high school as well, I was able to sit with, alhamdulillah, a sheikh who used to live here, but then he moved to Medina, and he studied 13 years in Masjid Nabawi. He has ijazah in almost any book that you can say he has an ijazah in that book. He's quite old now. He lives in Windsor, but he's probably moving back to the Middle East. But he taught us, mostly his focus was on fiqh and hadith. These were his specialties. So we used to spend the summers with him. And we used to study Al-Bulugh al-Marram, for example. We studied with him. We studied a number, Arba'in an-Nawawi is where we started, but we studied a number of books of hadith with him, and he was very strict. So we would start at Fajr, and he would teach continuously without break until Dhuhr, and that was his condition, that we're not going to take a break, because we only have 2 or 3 days a week. And then I went to university, and this is, I think, where the first kind of challenge starts. So the biggest difference between what I was doing before in terms of my Islamic knowledge journey and what was happening in university was that there was a disconnect in terms of having a teacher. So all of the points up till then, there was some sort of mentor or teacher, a murabbi, some type of a teacher that's teaching me, or a group of people that I had a personal connection with. University was the first time where that kind of stopped. So the teacher that I was memorizing with, he left, he went back to Pakistan. Sheikh Falah, he went to Medina. And I don't know if any of you would have remembered, but this era of Islamic weekend courses started. So they had 2 institutions, Al-Maghrib and Al-Kawthar. Okay, and these were weekend courses. You would go, they'd set them up at universities, they'd have a curriculum, they would bring a sheikh, usually someone like a graduate from Medina University, and you do a topic. It's tafsir of a surah, fiqh of salah, dua, whatever. And you do it for a weekend, and it's a course, there's a booklet. It's a fun thing. We used to go as friends, and you sleep over, you stay in Toronto, you stay in the masjid, whatever. And I did this throughout my university career, and I didn't have a direct teacher, but I was still learning through those kind of courses. And at the end of that, I got married, and things change when you get married, because in my case at least, my spouse and I were at different levels in terms of our Islamic knowledge. I had been very, very involved in teaching. So during this whole time, I was also teaching. I taught for more than a decade and a half at Al-Huda schools, weekend schools. Many people you know in the university who have led here, Abdul Wadud, for example, Abdul Hannan, these were students in my classes. But at that point, everything kind of stopped when I had a family, and I was very, very involved in the community and learning, but my wife wasn't. And the interesting thing that started to rise was I would get questions. How do we do this? What's the fiqh of this? I don't understand this concept, right? And the thing that triggered me around the idea that there's a problem here was when my response to that was, hold on, I got to go check. And where did I check? That was always the question. And this is a really important thing for you, if you're interested in Islamic knowledge, is when you have a question, where do you go? This tells you how close you are to the right path in terms of where you're taking your knowledge from. Okay, so where I would go by default, if there was a question that wasn't obvious and I needed to know the fiqh of it, for example, when you have children, okay, after a woman has children, there's a period of time where she can't pray. It's a period called nifas. When does the nifas end? Okay, how do I find that out? I obviously didn't study that. Okay, I didn't come across that in any weekend course, right? And so the website I go to, Islam QA. How many of you guys know about Islam QA? Okay, Sheikh Salih Munajjid. Okay, mashallah, like, amazing website and an amazing work that he's doing. Okay, but one interesting thing happened is that I looked at that and I said, well, hold on here. I don't know Sheikh Salih. I don't know him. I've never met him. What he presents to me in this article is some evidences, and then a conclusion, and often the opinion of scholars, right? So you have a few scholars, here's some evidences, here's a conclusion, and I take that. So then I thought, hey, this message that has often been in my mind and has been promoted, that you shouldn't blindly follow. Taqleed is a problem. Is not that exactly what I'm doing? Right? Because the question is not, do you have an evidence? It's, can you apply the evidence to the mas'ala and how do you interpret it? That's the real question. It's not about, oh, is there an ayah and is there a hadith? And this is where things kind of changed for me. Okay, and so I reconnected with something that I had access to earlier in my life. So one of the things I didn't mention is, and I kind of glazed over it, this period of, okay, I started learning Quran, then all of a sudden I started memorizing Quran, and then there was a sheikh involved. How did that actually happen? How did my family change? The way my family changed was my sister, who was the most unlikely person to marry a religious person, married an alim. She married an imam. She was the most unlikely person, I'm telling you. I don't want to tell you about who she was, but she is the most unlikely person to have married a person of knowledge, and she married an alim. She married a sheikh. I was 14 years old. We have a seven-year gap between us. Okay, how this happened was I have a cousin who lived in New York, and he got married to a woman there. And one day, kind of out of the blue, he calls my mom on the Thanksgiving long weekend, and he says, "I'm off for the weekend. Can you make me turkey?" And my mom's like house, it's famous for like people come and she cooks. So he's like, "Okay, come." And he's like, "I'm gonna bring my wife. You haven't met her." So she's like, "Fantastic." So they get into Canada, and his wife tells him, "Hey, I have a brother who's studying at a school in Ajax. He's kind of off. He's kind of homesick. Can we just pick him up and he can join us for the weekend?" So my mom said yes. They said yes. They went and picked him up. That person ended up becoming my brother-in-law. He was studying the Alamiya course in a madrasa in Ajax. That's not where he finished. He ended up finishing with his Sheikh Mufti Nawar Rahman in Chicago, and then took his ijazat from a number of scholars from Iraq and Syria. But that person then entered our family, and then our entire family kind of changed through that, including myself. And that was right at the period where, for me, I was looking for that type of guidance. But the thing that was challenging for me as a kind of young Muslim starting to enter the fold of Islam and becoming more practicing was that he was of the Hanafi madhab. So he practiced the Hanafi madhab, and he practiced it quite rigidly. And if you know, students who are at the beginning of their journey as a talib al-ilm, whether it doesn't matter what institution you go to, the teacher is going to focus you very much, either through a book or through a madhab in fiqh and aqidah. You're going to get focus. And then if you go and teach that, it's going to come off as something quite rigid, right? And so I would always have questions where I say, well, you're saying this opinion, but there's this hadith here. This other person is saying that's a weak opinion. And he was a student, he didn't know how to answer that. And that's what kind of repelled me from that. And I went down the path of, the weekend courses and all those kind of things. And then, so fast forward back to when I got married. At that point, I'm like, I need to re-engage with, and I think the right thing to re-engage with and look at again is the madhab system. So this might be a little controversial for some people. And I'm fully aware that, some people very much subscribe to the idea that we shouldn't follow a madhab. And I also followed that. But you've asked me for challenges and details here, so I'm gonna tell you about them. Okay, so at that time I'm like, no, this doesn't make any sense. The whole point of having evidence is knowing how to interpret and apply that evidence, and that cannot be done without a system. We need to have consistency in our interpretation. When we find this strength of hadith, what types of rulings can it be applied to? And we need to be consistent in that. That is called usul. That is the foundation of a madhab. I'm like, all right, I need to access a scholar that I can learn this from properly, and who can help me with the questions, because I had a lot of questions. So alhamdulillah, I made dua for that, and Allah put somebody right in front of me, who's now been my teacher for more than 5 years. Alhamdulillah. Studied a number of books with him. May Allah preserve him. His father was one of the imams in Al-Haram. He comes from a long lineage of scholars, mashallah. He has ijazat He has ijazat in all the qira'at of Quran. He's an expert in Shafi'i fiqh, and that's the fiqh that we learned. Unfortunately, we lost his presence because he moved back to Jordan a number of years ago, about a year and a half ago. But we still stayed connected with him, and he connected us with other scholars of his ilk and type that I've continued to kind of study with. So that's kind of the story on the ilm side. Okay, just to give you a short summary. The main thing I want to convey to you here as a lesson is you need a teacher. And the point where I was the most lost and where I benefited the least and where my Islamic education slowed down the most was a point when I did not have a direct teacher, despite having access to courses and knowledge online. Despite that, without having a murabbi, a person that I connect with personally, really slowed down my knowledge and impacted my understanding of the knowledge. And it's only now, many years on, that I realize, and you look at and you study the tradition of Islam and Islamic knowledge more and more, you realize that this is the way our deen was conveyed. If you know anything about how to learn Islam, Islam is transmitted through asanid, through a system of sanad. The teacher gives ijazah to the student, and there are different types of ijazat. There is ijazah barakah. A sheikh might read a text, and everyone who is present, he say, I give you ijazah. There's an ijazah to teach, right? And so some people have that. They've sat with the sheikh, and the sheikh is convinced that I have taught you, you have been present, and some shuyukh are more strict than others. Some of them will say, if you were in my class and I recognized you, you're fine. Others will say, I want to see you teach. They won't give you ijazah until you teach for 5 years, 10 years. Then they'll give you ijazah. But the point is that when you learn, you attach yourself to a chain of authenticity, an authentic chain. This is how we ensure that what we're learning is correct and authentic. All right? And so this is kind of the main lesson that I would encourage you. But I'll pause there. I'm sure you have other questions. But that's the Islamic journey and kind of the key lesson that I would want to convey.
So there are a lot of questions, a lot of things to go through there.
All right.
I want to focus quickly about the very last part about that you need a teacher
Sure.
to properly learn it. And so what do you recommend doing as, you've been electrical engineer, bismillah, mashallah, you're at University of Water, you know how hard it is for students. How are you supposed to get that teacher while also ensuring that you're focusing and doing the best that you can both on co-op and academics so you could create the best possible life for yourself?
So I might not be the best role model in that regard. Although, alhamdulillah, I've been successful. But I had terms where I had horrible marks because I was focused on everything but school. I had terms where I had to negotiate with the professor to bump up a percentage here and a percentage there so that I don't drop under the 60% mark. I also had terms where my average was in the 90s, right? So I knew how to perform if I needed to, but there were definitely times where I'm like, school is not a focus. And I'm not recommending that you do that. Balance is better if you can achieve it. But for me, it kind of worked out in that way where I played that, I don't know if you want to call it a game, but I often do that today at work as well. So even the way I function at work is, and I've tried to find a culture that aligns with the way that I work, which is hold me accountable to what needs to be delivered, not to how you want me to deliver it, right? And so even if I'm at work today, if I feel like at 3 o'clock, hey, I'm done, and most of my days are meetings. And so if I'm done and I don't have anyone else to talk to at 3 o'clock, I'm signing off, and the document I had to write, the email I had to send, I might do that at 10 in the night. I might do that at 4 in the morning. But leave it up to me when I get my things done, as long as I get them done and I'm consistent with that. But in terms of when you're actually in university, how do you do this? I would say that the schedule of a student is quite challenging to work around. And I remember in electrical engineering, to be or not to be was the name of kind of the term. It's a pretty hard term. It's a lab term. So there's lots of labs. The concepts start to get yeah, the concepts start to get harder and harder. And it's like, okay, well, where do you find time? And honestly, sometimes you just have to focus on that, right? And I think this is an important idea, is that when we talk about consistency, there's ups and downs in consistency, right? And so the important thing is that you might say, hey, well, listen, this month, I can just hold on to the bare minimum. I'm going to do my salah, and I'm going to do my daily wird of Quran. And that's really all that I can manage because of all the other stuff that's going on. But the key thing is that when your time does free up, then that balance needs to shift back. into that, right? And a teacher who's understanding of your kind of your situation can help you do that. A teacher can also help push you through that, right? I think a lot of times, if I reflect back and I think about the amount of time I had in university, when I was in university, I would say I am super busy and it's super stressful. Guys, girls, if I were in university right now, it would be like a walk in the park in terms of the amount of time I have. Okay, the amount of responsibilities pile up exponentially when you exit, whether that's through work, family, children, your own personal development, dealing with your parents and family who are now aging and getting older, continue to contribute to the community. There are a limited amount of responsibilities that start to build. And the key thing is, and this is what I tell everybody, especially people who I mentor from a career perspective, there's a lot of people who are afraid to go up into a leadership position, right? And one of their fears is, how am I going to handle it all, right? I got to learn on the job. I have a team to manage. I have more things to do. The very first thing to recognize is that there is a period of acclimation. When you're climbing a mountain, right, you have to acclimatize, correct? You cannot go straight to that part where the oxygen levels are low. You have to go up and down, up and down. You have to get your lungs used to that. And it's the same thing. After a while, you can sustain yourself there, right? And it's the same thing as you add more responsibility to your life. You can do that. In the beginning, it seems really hard. But you have to recognize that your mindset has to be prepped in the sense that it is going to be hard. I haven't done this before, and it's okay for me to take a step back, but then re-engage and go a little further, re-engage, go a little further, until you start to get used to the level of commitment. So I think it's very possible, if you do find a teacher, to actually do both. But there are challenges, and you just have to recognize that it's going to feel difficult, but you shouldn't give up. And the right teacher will help you stay firm on that and help you continue. But that would be my advice.
Brothers, you guys have any sisters as well? Any questions just before I continue on? I don't want to go too fast. Good, alhamdulillah. Oh yeah.
So I'll tell you that every teacher that I ever had came to me. Not that I was not seeking. So the key thing is that you have to set out on a journey. Okay? You have to set out with the intention that you want to do something, and that intention has to be sincere. And you need to make dua for that. And depending on the level of sincerity of your intention, and if the time is right for you or not, Allah will open doors for you and open paths for you. And this is what I have found personally, right? You can go and register yourself in an institution or in a class, and I've done that, and you should do that, right? That's a way to show your intention. But for example, with my last teacher, where I told you, I was at that crossroads, and I'm like, I need a teacher to teach me this properly. I made dua for that. That's what I did. I spent the month of Ramadan in 2017 making dua for that thing. Okay, and I had a very specific dua, and I said, I want to learn the Shafi'i madhab. That's what I wanted to do. And subhanAllah, after Ramadan, right after the first Jummah after Ramadan, I met a brother who I know for a long time, who lives in California but was visiting. And I told him, hey man, I don't know, it came up, and I said, hey, I really want to learn this. And he's like, hold on. I think there might be somebody. And he's like, let me talk to another brother we know. His name's Taimur. Taimur was studying at Laurier, and he had heard that there is a professor at Laurier who is an alim, who is finishing his PhD and who's teaching there, and he's doing his PhD in cybersecurity. So let me talk to him and see if he'd be willing to teach on the 2 days a week that he's here in town. And that's how that started. And so it started through that connection. Sheikh Qutayba agreed to it. We started meeting twice a week, and then that continued. And slowly over the years, he added courses. When he finished at Laurier, we would go to his house in Brampton. We would study with him personally in his home on the weekends. But oftentimes that was a journey of making dua, has been my experience. And I think that make dua, make istikhara. One of the blessings of istikhara is that you're asking for Allah to make something easy for you. right? And so things start to fall in place. And so, inshallah, that's what I would say. That's been my personal experience with it. With regards to the sisters, what I encouraged, alhamdulillah, my wife was able to kind of go down this journey as well. And for her, it was a little bit different. There isn't as easy access to somebody in a masjid or a professor here or someone here where you can just go and build that connection. And so there was actually, MAC is very active here. And there are some people in MAC, whether you agree with the ideology or not, okay? I myself no longer work with MAC. But I know people in MAC, and I know some extremely knowledgeable and sincere people. Amongst them is Sister Rania Lawendi. And she is a sister who, since I was a child, was a mentor for me. And our families were very close. So when I got married, Sister Rania said, well, I have an usra, why doesn't your wife join it? And for me, that was a no-brainer. Yeah, we're not part of MAC, but I don't really care. If you have an opportunity to sit with her once a week, you go and sit with her, right? And so that's where it kind of started. And that raised a lot of things, right? So that got you connected back with Quran and learning tajweed and discussing topics and reading books. And then eventually that transitioned to an online group of sisters. There's an institution called Rabat, and Rabat has a program called Rabita. Rabita is it's for sisters only. The teachers are all sheikhas, mostly from Syria, and their students who they've taught here, who teach courses across the board. So if you look at one of the most, today in the English language, one of the best sources for Sirah, it's a 2-volume book. It's written by a sister, Sheikha Samira Zayed. You might see it's a green cover, 2 thick textbooks with gold rimmed pages. One of the translators for that book worked for Rabita and was teaching a Sirah course based on that book. So my wife was like, I want to join the course. So we're like, okay, fine, join the course. And that ended up being amazing because it was very personalized. So they connected. My wife did a bunch of work for them. She now works for Rabita. She's designing books for them. She's a graphics designer, but she has access to those teachers. She studied fiqh with them. They have Quran classes. And so she found her community right through that path. So that's a very particular path. But the idea is seize opportunities and seek to find a community. Go beyond just the online course. I was speaking to a brother just a couple of weeks ago where he's like, hey, I really want to just get a baseline on Islamic knowledge. So I'm thinking about enrolling in this online institute. And I'm like, that's not a bad idea. To get a baseline, fantastic. But you are very quickly going to want to go beyond that, where you find a community, right? And for me, that community was built around a person. That community could be built around an institute. It could be built around something else. But the idea is find a community that has people that you can genuinely connect with, rather than just consuming information, right? And that's maybe another lesson from my own journey, is that there's a difference between information and ilm. These are different things, and we shouldn't confuse them. A thing that you read online or something you read in a book, this can become ilm. This can become something you do practice on by the way that you inculcate it into your life. But many things in our religion need to be taught. And that aspect of ilm is included in the way that it's taught. In fact, there are books, classical books, even if you know Arabic perfectly, you will not be able to understand what's written in those books because they're written in code. Our ulama were polymaths. They were people of amazing academic strength. You will not be able to understand their books and their writings. To be able to, for example, if you look at Sahih al-Bukhari, you and I read that, we open the book and read a hadith. Guys, the organization of Sahih al-Bukhari, there are books written on how Imam al-Bukhari organized his Sahih. It's amazing. It's amazing. But you can only access this through people of knowledge, right? And so that's the difference. You can read and learn, and you should. You should always be self-learning. But if you want to really inculcate that knowledge and you want it to transform you, my recommendation is to connect with a community, connect with a teacher.
That's alhamdulillah. I hope that answers everything. But there's one thing I wanted to return back to. Something
Yeah.
that you said. You said that with electrical engineering, to be or not to be, you must need to know when to prioritize certain things. If you're in a term right now and your course load's heavy,
Yep.
you know, you're gonna have to focus on that, but to learn to switch as well. How, you know, with everything that people you see online, everyone says like Dino Verdunia on TikTok, everyone Dino Verdunia, and that gets everyone's heads like, oh, am I focusing too much on my dunya? Am I focusing on my career? How are you supposed to make that balance? How are you supposed to ensure that, you know, you're prioritizing your education when you're on your academic term, but you make that effective switch with the same passion and the same with the same passion, the same drive that you have during the academic term. And the flip side is true too. How can I pursue my academics with the same passion and the same drive as I do with Islam?
So the first thing I'll say is that for me, kind of answering this question 10 years out of university, hindsight is 2020. I can give you advice on how I think you should think and what your mindset should be, and I will. But I'll tell you that during that time period, that wasn't my mindset. Like my mindset was not clear, because what I'm going to talk about is the idea of intention, right? Having the right intention can help you look at that priority as something that benefits you in your deen, right? Or an aspect of your deen, which is important. But I wasn't thinking like that. I'll be completely honest with you. Like I was in school for a number of reasons. Money was never a reason for me personally. One of the reasons was it was just, and this is, I think, a reason that people don't realize, that you're in a system. The idea that at age 5, you go to kindergarten, and then you go to elementary school and middle school and high school and then university, and then you work and then you retire. That is a carefully crafted narrative that works within, and that runs the society that we live in here. That is what runs the society. It produces people who then contribute to the economy, who pay taxes, and that system, that machine runs. It works. Okay? So a lot of times you end up where you are not having consciously thought about it. And I would say in university, that was my position. I was like, yeah, I mean, I did good in high school. Like I had some level of natural competitiveness where I'm like, I'm not going to fail. So I'm going to get good marks. I am going to get into a good university. My parents had put that in my mind, and I want to come back to this. My parents had put it in my mind: doctor, engineer, lawyer. These are your options. These are the these are the things you're good. And not like not forcefully. I seldom remember my parents looking at my grades, but these were things often talked about in my household, especially on my mom's side, because my grandfather and grandmother were not educated. And my grandfather, he vowed, he said, if I'm going to have children, and he had 9 children, he said, they will all be educated. And his goal was, I want them all to be doctors. I believe 5 out of my 9 aunts and uncles are doctors, and every one of their kids are doctors. There are probably over 50 or 60 doctors in my family, of every type of practice that you can imagine. And so obviously this was a thing that translated into my household, right? And so I ended up where I was just because, like, this is the thing to do. You go to school, you go to university. What am I good at? Is it science? No, I don't like biology. So okay, I enjoyed tinkering. I liked electronics. I went into engineering. Fantastic. Got into co-op. Good. Paying for my education. Wonderful. My parents are super happy. I don't have to spend a dime on this child. Do your education. Co-op pays for your school. You'll get a good job after. And my dad was so happy with this. It's one of the reasons why he continues to be happy with things with me, despite my father kind of lagging in terms of coming on Islamically versus the rest of the family. He didn't mind it with me too much because I always maintained that side of things that he found very important, right? Think about that immigrant mentality. Someone coming from another country without education, working for people, working in labor jobs, factory jobs, constant politics, discrimination, racism. The only thing he wants for his kids is to not have to face that. And what's been taught is that happens through education, right? So the reality was I was there because that's where the system got me, okay? Now, my advice to you. I think that as young Muslims, you need to focus on becoming a high value person, all right? You're going to hear a lot, and you do hear about, I hear a lot about high net worth individuals, okay? People who have a certain bank account, a certain salary, certain cars, homes, assets, etc. These people are defined by their degrees, by their wealth, by their material assets and what they own, okay? And there's a lot of discussion especially as some of these aspects of the red pill, there's a green pill version of that movement, starts to kind of push forward, that surface some of these ideas, right? Especially for men. And in contrast to that, I say you need to be a high value individual, and that consists of two primary components. The first component is that you need to have principles. This is the very first kind of component. This is that you need to have principles by which you live your life. Okay, and you need to be a principled person. And what I would say is, if you want to know what are the principles you should live your life by, right? Obviously, if I ask you, you would say, well, we should look at the Quran and Sunnah, and that's correct. If I were to give you a specific source that you can say, hey, like this is a really interesting read that will help me understand the character of a Muslim and the principles that I should live by, go and read Ash-Shifa by Qari Iyad. Okay? This is a book that talks about the character of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it breaks it down by his characteristics. So it talks about his courage, it talks about his generosity, it talks about his fortitude. Okay, and by that you can start to learn what were the characteristics of this man sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is the best of creation, and how do I take what's in Allah's book and implement that? What's the example of that? That's a really succinct work that has been taught, and you can find many courses online that teach this book, or you can get the book and read it yourself. It's translated into English. That will help you start a foundation for what some of those principles should be in your life. Okay, many of those principles, by the way, need to be derived from a basic level of knowledge. All right, so that comes back to what we were talking about before. You need to learn some fiqh, but I want to just pause on that for a sec because I want to get to point number 2. So being a high value person means you are a principled person. The second thing is that your goal in life is to benefit Allah's deen and to benefit people in general. That needs to be your goal. And so that narrative that was in my family is not a narrative that I want to put into my children. I don't want to say to my kids, you have to be a doctor, because the goal is not to be a doctor. It can be. That can be a noble profession, but it depends on what you do with it, right? And so if the goal is to help people, right, to serve Allah's creation, the impoverished people, sick people, resuscitate them, go and help them in impoverished countries, and to apply your skill set, and the way you do that is through becoming a doctor and going through that path of education, Bismillah, do it. But I don't want to encourage my children to have that idea of the career is the goal. And I would encourage that for you too. As you seek balance, these are the two things that you need to have set in your mind first as you look at your career as to what you're doing. What are my principles? And what am I trying to do? What's my why? How am I benefiting the deen? How am I generating benefit rather than just chasing a degree, chasing a paycheck, okay, or chasing some kind of an output? You want to chase an outcome, all right? And then it becomes really easy because that's your litmus test. So if I look at my job today, that job either needs to directly serve these things. So either it is part of it helps me to apply my principles and preserve them, and through that job, I directly benefit Allah's deen. That's the ideal scenario, but that is an unlikely scenario. So the way I see my job is that at the very least, it cannot hinder these things, okay? And what I'm getting at here is that for me personally, my purpose in life is not my job. And I tell this to people at work. We just had a huge restructuring. My boss, the engineering VP of product, got sacked. They got tossed out of the company. The CEO came in, restructured everything. People are super stressed out. People ask me, how am I doing? For me, it's just another day because that's not my life. I know how to function there. I know how to produce results there. But that's not my purpose, right? And I think that becomes very important. That single fact helps me prioritize things because it means that I'm not going to sacrifice teaching my kids or time with my family. At least I'm not going to do that consistently for somebody else's worldly gain. I'm not going to do that. At the same time, if I'm ever put in a position at work where I have to sacrifice my principles, if I'm asked to do something haram, or that becomes a problem, I'll give you an example. I recently traveled to Phoenix. to speak at a conference, and we had a large presence at that conference. We had about 30 to 40 people between executives, salespeople, marketers, product managers. And on the second night of that conference, because we had a lot of vendors and customers, they held a huge dinner event. Where was that event? It was at a bar, right? It was at a big kind of rooftop bar, obviously alcohol. I'm not going to go to that. And I don't need to explain to anyone in my role why I don't go. I'm just not going to show up. That's not what I do, right? Is a client there? Is the CEO there? I don't really care, because I have principles that I don't compromise, right? And so the very first thing, if you want to figure out how do we prioritize, this is the first thing. Establish your principles, figure out your why. This is an important thing. Maybe I'll save it for after. And I think, yeah, for me, those are the kind of two main things to help you kind of prioritize it. Yeah.
Sorry, no one.
Yeah.
Have any tips for navigating work ideology, like counseling agencies?
So I don't personally have any experience with that. It's hard because if that's the education you have and you've spent, tens of thousands of dollars pursuing a degree that sets you up for that, and then you're being told that you have to promote a certain idea, right? And you need to support people without telling them. And this becomes more challenging when, let's say, the person who you're working with is a Muslim, or you might know that there are Muslim families where someone in the family, a daughter or a son, decides to say, hey, I want to either change my gender, or I'm lesbian, or I'm homosexual, or whatever it might be, and the parents are very upset with that. And what happens is that person talks to a counselor at school. What's the conversation the counselor has with the parents? The conversation is, you need to stop pushing, otherwise this could go really badly for your family and the other kids in your household. And so let him or her do what they want, is essentially the message that you get back. Now, if you're put in that position, like, this is a very specific scenario, but my point is that you're going to be placed in a position where you have to compromise your principles, right? And so for me personally, I bias that towards my, the answer I gave before, where if I have to sacrifice my principles, I can't do that. And so either I need to carve out a role or an aspect within that career path that doesn't force me to compromise, or I need to look at something else.
Sorry, no, there's one other question.
Yeah.
Is it allowed to make money off
It's a bit of a loaded question. Is it allowed? Like, is it halal? Yeah, I mean, I want to. About 4 months ago, there's a charity that reached out to its top donors in every region, and they said, "Can we meet with you in a face-to-face meeting? We want to talk about how we scale the impact that we have for our charity in Canada." Okay, so I was part of that meeting, and one of the challenges they had was, how much money do we spend on marketing? How much money do we spend on promotion? Because there is a direct correlation between the marketing spend and the donation revenue. I don't want to necessarily call it revenue, but the amount of donation you receive, and hence that's proportional to the impact that you can have, right? But that does involve, now, there are some scholars who charge a lot of money for that, right? And in the past, this used to be a conversation with a person of knowledge. You talk directly to them. You don't talk to them anymore, guys. You talk to their assistant, and their assistant has a rate card, and their assistant says, this is the type of hotel, this is the type of airline, this is the type of seat, This is the amount of money. If you want them to do this for all of Ramadan and they're part of these campaigns, are they appearing on ads? Are they appearing in print, video, audio, whatever? There's a rate for all of that. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that's haram or that's wrong. But I think you and I can come to the conclusion that, I mean, the charity that I'm talking about, the reason they had a conflict was in particular they work in zakat. Now imagine you're spending funds, right? Even potentially under one of the categories of zakat, because one of the categories is to pay the mu'amilin, the people who are actually part of the system of distributing the zakat. So if they're consuming that to pay these these crazy fees and rates, that is a definite conflict here, right? And that's one of the questions they had, like, how do we navigate this? What do we do here, right? I won't get into the discussion what we kind of landed on, but I would say that there's, I don't know, I find this hard. I find this difficult. And the reason I find this difficult is more so for the person who's doing it. So my brother-in-law, I told you he is a sheikh. He was an imam for a number of years. When you live with an imam and you have close proximity to the imam, you start to learn about the reality of politics. You think you might know by working with the masjid what masjid politics looks like. You don't know until the imam is in your house and he's your relative. Then you know what the politics look like. One of the reasons why he left the world of being an imam was because he found he had to compromise his deen based on the source of his paycheck. And I find that as a very sincere conclusion, right? Is that, you know, if you're ever put in that situation where I've tied my livelihood to the religion, and so I have to modulate what I say, I have to modulate my opinions, because the board is going to get angry, or, you know, it doesn't work like that, or this or that, then you really compromise the sincerity you have. And so he stepped away from that, and that took a lot of courage. And he had to figure out a new income stream. That's where he was making money from, right? So he had to completely, you know, rejig his life to figure this out. So, as I said, I can't say that it's haram, but there's a level of discomfort.
So, Ibrahim, yeah.
Qadi Iyad is famous. You should first study about Qadi Iyad and then his works.
There's a question. There's something that you brought up. You said that your father was kind of the last to acclimate to the whole, becoming a better Muslim and everything in your family. What would you recommend to other students who might see that, their parents are, maybe this wasn't in your case, but generally, if some students, their parents are against their, pursuing of even basic level Islamic education, because you're putting into this world class education institution, and you should pursue it 110%, and then they'll say, okay, yeah, once you graduated, once you have a family, then pursue what you want. What would you say to those, and with the idea that you have to obey your parents, you have to listen to your parents? How should somebody navigate that?
When my tahfidh teacher left, he recommended to my dad, he said, your son has a propensity to memorize. You should pause his school and let him focus in a madrasa or with a teacher for a year and let him just finish. My dad said, no, that's not going to happen. And that really affected me. That really affected my memorization. If that had happened, I would be in a different place. But my dad said no to that. And he had every right and authority at that age to say no to that. But it did kind of paint a picture where I was kind of frustrated. And I remember there was a day where a brother in this community passed away, a very well-known brother. Brother Tariq Naqvi, may Allah have mercy on him. We went to his funeral, and I went with my dad. And it was a very emotional funeral, for myself too. And we're driving on the way home, and I noticed in the funeral and even in the car, I felt as if my dad was not affected like the other people. Like, it was kind of seemed like a normal kind of thing to him, like he was just his normal self. And so, I told him, I said to him, Dad, this is written for everybody. And, may Allah preserve and elongate your life, but you're also getting to that age where this is something that should start to affect your behavior. You should think about it more. My dad didn't talk to me for 3 days. He's very upset that I told him that. And we never really talked about it. And I did not realize why until just after university. Allah put a test in front of me, which was perhaps the most challenging and difficult test that I've ever gone through. And in that test, in that moment, I saw something of my dad that I had never seen before. I saw courage come out of him that reflected his iman and showed me that his iman was stronger than mine. And from that day, what it made me realize is that there's a difference between how a person looks and what they say and what's inside of them. This shouldn't always be true. For a Muslim should strive to be sadiq. Sidq is when our heart matches our actions. That's what it means. Some people are one way or the other. On the surface, they pray, they have a beard, they say all the right things. But when they're tested, when they're pushed, they cave, they crumble. My dad was the opposite. On the outside, it didn't look like the fundamentals of the religion had really impacted him. But when he was pushed and when we were tested as a family, the person who stood, the person who had the courage was him and not me. Okay? And so what that helped me just do is empathize a little bit. Okay? Empathize that, first of all, change takes time and that I don't know people. I cannot assume who my dad is based on the surface level of his actions. Okay? Especially when he takes the role of a father with me. He exposes some things, he doesn't expose some things, right? About himself and about his feelings. And so this is the first piece of advice that I would have, is just realize that when you're dealing with your parents, have some humility and have some empathy and recognize that change takes time. Even for you, it takes time. Many people don't realize this. I told you about my sister, right? How she was the last person to marry a religious person. You can assume that what that meant is that she would have changed rapidly, right? She would, if she was not practicing and then she married a scholar, she would have changed overnight, seemingly. And she did. But remember that change on the surface is not necessarily change on the inside, right? And so even though you might have changed on your surface, that doesn't mean you changed on the inside. There are many things lacking in you and I. We can grow a beard and pray and say we're involved in this and say all the right things, right? But those things are just pieces on the surface. That knowledge, that practice, it's all there, but it's not until it's tested do you know who you really are. And our parents have gone through test after test after test. If I think about the test that my parents went through, the fact that they're still Muslim, that they still encourage their family, they still have an Islamic identity, that took a lot of courage. My dad was born literally the year of the partition of India and Pakistan. He was likely born. They don't even know when he was born because the state of Pakistan didn't exist. He was likely born in transition as his family migrated to Karachi, where they eventually settled. Right? So to go from that and to hold on to your religion through all of the turmoil there of coming to Canada, getting involved with people, having bad influences, and still on Fridays, my dad would sit with us and open the Mus'haf and say, we need to read Surah Al-Kahf. This is the one thing that he used to do. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. Sometimes we underestimate this because we have naivete based on our limited experience in life. So I would say be patient. Have respect and recognize that change takes time. It takes little drops, right? Something that's a stone overnight doesn't develop a well. It doesn't develop a crack over time. It takes consistent drops, bit by bit, bit by bit.
I know it's a little bit different than the topic here, but what about change with like women you want to marry? Do you recommend us marrying someone who wants us to change? Wait for her to change, or her to wait for us to change?
First of all, just be honest with yourself first, right? Yeah, I think you need to know who you are. So if in your mind you are more than you really are, and you're trying to match someone with you, and you're going to put demands out that you actually can't stand behind, that's a problem. But let's assume that we're in a place where we're saying, yeah, like I need someone who's on the same wavelength as me. And so this particular situation where if somebody says, well, I'm going to change, I promise I'm going to change. It really depends on what we're talking about in the context of that. But if it's something serious, I would be very hesitant. There are some situations where, like I remember a brother, before he became Muslim, he was dating a Muslim sister. And she didn't wear hijab, but she was Muslim. After he became Muslim, he became very practicing. And he transformed his life. And the very first thing he said to her was, we're not going to date, you have to marry me. She was okay. They got married. After a couple of years, he said, I feel like I've given you enough time, and it's really a boundary for me that you don't practice hijab. That's something that I can't get past. And so we need, and so that conversation, and she said, okay, I promise I'm going to do it. And it worked out, right? I would say that that's kind of a rare situation for me personally. And I think that your marriage, you want it to be something that accelerates you, that helps you. And you need someone who is mostly there. No one's going to be on the exact same wavelength as you, but someone who is close. Someone who isn't, there isn't a major kind of difference between where you are and where they are, and especially if they're doing things that for you are a boundary, right? So I think one thing that I'll recommend is before you start a family, have in your mind, just like you have principles like I recommended for yourself, have principles that you have in your household and in your family. Have that in mind. Before I got married, I noticed that there are some very successful families, and I said, I want to interview these brothers. They were uncles, brothers. I wanted to talk to them to say, how did you do this? I want to set my family up like that. There was a lot of advice. The one consistent thing that I found was that they had a plan. It was a consciously thought out plan. They said, these are the principles we're going to have in our home. This is what we're going to align on. This is what we're not going to compromise on. And they had that from the beginning. So if you start to think about that, then I think you can apply that in your process of finding a spouse. And I think that you should apply that. I don't think that you should sacrifice that. And I think you should be patient. Unless the situation is really dire, you should be patient to make sure that somebody falls within the realm of your principles and not to sacrifice that.
Well, Jazakallah khairan on behalf of the MSA and everyone else here. Jazakallah khairan. And thank you for coming out. And it's incredible.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. And Jazakallah khairan everyone else for coming. And inshallah, we'll see you guys next week.
So